All right, welcome back. And we're no longer talking about this, which is the Nicomachean Ethics. We're on to something very different. We're on to this, which is the Politics. And they're very different because this one's a little bit wider than that one. But they actually contain quite different things. But remember, in the previous videos, I've been stressing, well, especially the sort of the wrap-up one on the Nicomachean Ethics, that it's a lead into the Politics. Aristotle regarded all of this as a piece. So if it would have been up to Aristotle, no doubt, this would actually be one book, like one volume, as we would say. So what's going on here? Well, I gave a little overview of the Politics, some of its problems, and an overview of the general flavor of the book in the previous video. Go check that out. What I want to do today is, in this video, is look at Book 1, Chapter 1. And here he starts laying the groundwork for what he's going to do in this work we call the Politics. And again, remember the Politics is more of a jumbled up kind of collection than a really well-organized treatise, more or less as the Nicomachean Ethics is pretty well organized, way more organized than the Politics. Nonetheless, we get a good idea of what Aristotle's up to, and it's very similar to what he's doing, at least methodologically, in the Nicomachean Ethics. Okay, so he starts off with, and he's going to start off by laying out the building blocks. But before we get into that, I just want to make a few comments here. Recall that in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 1, so it's actually not a bad idea to take a copy of the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 1, have it open beside you while you read the Politics, and you can see how Aristotle speaks in a very similar way. It's just that he's jumping a level up. So that's how I like to think of it. It's not not a perfect way. It doesn't work all the time. But in general, just think of the Politics as a level up. The Nicomachean Ethics was saying, on a personal wavelength, more or less, or maybe in a small sense of things like dealing with contracts and different kinds of arrangements we have. What should we do? What's kind of the way to act and the way to be and all that stuff about virtue and how should we think and all that stuff about the intellectual side. Here, he's taking it up a notch and saying, what are communities? What are states? How does this work? How are we going to fit things together such that we can create communities or some kind of structure within which the individuals can be real citizens, achieve eudaimonia, all that stuff, essentially becoming real human beings. Because remember, the whole idea of being a human being is you're kind of midway between the animals and the gods. But one of the ways that we're very different than both of those groups is gods don't have to live in communities, and neither do animals. Although Aristotle, being a biologist, he recognized a lot of animals do live in communities. But basically, what's outside the state and the community are animals and gods. And we're neither. So, back to Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 1. He says, Politics is the master art. Right? It's the big one. It runs it all. It's what are we to do? What are we to study in a state? Right? How is the rest going to fit inside of a state? That's all what Politics is about. And he says that right at the opening of the Nicomachean Ethics. So as you go and you read the Politics, go back and read the Nicomachean Ethics and you'll see how everything is leading up to what's going on in the Politics. And of course, you don't understand, it's hard to understand the Politics without the Nicomachean Ethics. But as you go back and you read the two together, they illuminate each other. All right, now I put a little arrow here down to a question mark. Well, what's a state, right? This seems to be a new thing. Well, we're going to get into that, and that's essentially what Aristotle's going to do in Book 1. He's going to talk a lot about that. As he always does, he wants to break things down. That's essentially his methodology. Recall also in the Nicomachean Ethics the discussion of philia. And remember, philia was this broad kind of base notion of fellow feeling, and a rough translation has been friendship. So this notion of philia in the context of the discussion of philia, he says a state is like a particular kind of organization or grouping of human beings. So remember, it's all about us. It's all about people. That's what Aristotle's talking about when he talks about the Nicomachean, when he's talking in the Nicomachean Ethics and when he's doing his thing in the Politics. Now, again, Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 1. The end, right? The goal, the for the sake of, or the final, the telos. Remember that term, the notion of a telos. The end of a human is to achieve, yes, our good old friend eudaimonia. And remember, we talked, probably ad nauseum about eudaimonia. This is extremely important. He stresses it right at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. But again, go back and read. He says the end of the state, the telos of the state, is even more important. So Aristotle is by no means stressing everything about the individual. So if you were to read Aristotle and stop reading in sections of the Nicomachean Ethics or just at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, it's easy to think that he's just, maybe going off on a tangent and saying, well, the best thing to do is this great life of contemplation, the blessedness at the end, that eudaimonia is a kind of this makarios sort of state of blessedness, and that's all you're supposed to do, kind of like a schooled up little scholarly life. Now, as much as I like that, and it appeals to me, I don't think that's really Aristotle's final story. It is part of it, it's important, but again, just because something is an important part of the story, don't just immediately infer that it's the whole story. So in this sense, the stress here is that as important as individuals are, the state is something that's even more important, according to Aristotle. And the state is not something that we just cook up. It's a natural object. It's just as natural as we are. So the state is something that you could say, maybe in a sense, that it's a kind of organic thing that emerges out of nature. And we'll look a little bit later as how Aristotle tries to tell, arguably it's a potted little story, and how seriously he takes it. Is debatable, but he does try to tell the story as sort of the natural origins of the state. So the state is a natural thing. It's not something that we ought to do or we decided or whatnot. No, it's a natural product. We have, as we've seen on Aristotle's account, a sense of free will. He's not totally devoid of it, because his discussions of choice certainly had elements of the notion of making real, non-predetermined decisions. But nonetheless, the state is something that's more or less organic, and we can tweak it. We can do some things with it. But the state per se is sort of there. All right, and we'll get more into that a little later. All right, so the state then is, he says, he's going to go on. It's the most sovereign organization we have. So when you think about all the collectivities that you belong to, which is the one that has the most power, that has, and not just necessarily the most power, but the one that's not governed from above? Because you can make claims like, well, something like maybe just in terms of raw power, right? That something like the United States military might be the most powerful collection on the planet, right? In that sense. Or even inside of a city, you might want to just talk about raw power, that the combined forces and weapons and everything in a police department have the most power. That's not what he means. It's the most sovereign. There's nothing, according to Aristotle, that's above the state, right? There's a state above me, right, governing me. I don't have the ability to opt out of things in the state, but states don't really have anything above them. It's kind of like today, right? You might make a sort of a similar kind of argument to kind of get what Aristotle's talking about is there's really nothing above states. We don't have a real world government. There are some international laws or whatever, but there's no parliament or whatever that's a world parliament that the states are subordinated to. People enter into agreements, and then, as what happened a little while ago in Great Britain, they voted to leave this agreement. So, okay, but when you're in it, you're bound by it, but you still have the option to get out, to opt out. that really doesn't apply to ordinary citizens. We can't really opt out. I mean, you'd have to leave the country altogether. But so Aristotle, for him, it is to be thought of as the highest level of sovereignty. So that gives you a bit of a hint. It's sort of the highest thing we got, right? Not just raw power, not in that sense, but and we'll try to unpack this notion of highest in a bit. All right, so he opens chapter 1 of the Politics. A couple of key terms. I wrote them up here. Every polis, which could be translated roughly as state or city, is a kind of koinonia. Koinonia is an old Greek term that is sort of like partnership, community, but be careful. Don't read too much political stuff or whatever into that. You want to keep it kind of loose. It's a unity that's maybe a little tighter than just a random aggregate of people, but it's not something that's absolutely as cohesive as can be. There are levels of koinonia. All right, so partnership, kind of community gathering, we can think of it that way. So this is very similar to the way that, structurally, to the way he talks at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics as well, because in this sense, there's a parallel we can draw. So every polis is a kind of koinonia. As I said, think of this in a loose sense, but think of this in terms of it has degrees. Degrees of unity. Okay? So you could have a very loose kind of koinonia where it might be just, like a coffee club or something. And you ask, why is this group of people called a coffee club? Well, simply put, the goal, the end, the telos of that group is to drink coffee together and have conversations, something like that. So that's a pretty loose gathering of people. Then a tighter gathering would be, a much tighter gathering, I'm jumping up quite a bit, would be like a family, right? And in a sense, like a family unit that, it has common ends and whatnot, and things that people all agree to, accept, buy into, whatever term you want, and they have common goals that they're trying to achieve. And so on, and so on, and so on. So there's different levels and degrees of unity. So the very notion of the koinonia in and of itself is kind of this sort of loose thing, but not just simply an aggregate. So not just like a random collection of people on the street. That wouldn't really be a specific koinonia, because there's no specific end that unites them all. I mean, like a really loose koinonia would be a group of people who happen to gather at a bus stop because they're all trying to catch the bus out downtown or out to the suburbs or whatever. So that would be an extremely loose group. But Aristotle, just this term can get us going into how he's thinking. But the key idea is what's pulling all of this together is a kind of telos of some sort. And the more complex and nuanced the telos, then the tighter the unity, right? So the Greeks were always worried about, why do we have unities? What's the property involved? And in this case, it is a telos. Okay, so if we recall in the opening passages of the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 1, every techne, remember, that's one of the ways in which the mind, the soul has truth. Every techne, every kind of activity that you do, and every methodos, like an investigation or an inquiry, aims at some agathos, right? So all these things Aristotle stressed, there was sort of, again, the old thing, the telos. This was done more or less at the individual level. Here in the chapter 1 now, book 1, chapter 1 of the Politics, instead of talking about things like techne and methodos, and instead of like technical activities or investigations, he's raising it up a notch and talking about it in terms of groups, partnerships, communities. Same thing, that the best, highest, greatest koinonia, the one that includes the others, they too are going to aim at something, and the best and the highest will aim at the highest agathos. So as we saw in book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, you could rank all these things that various activities were aiming at until eventually you get the master art of politics. And so the greatest of the koinonia, which will include all the others, as kind of like little, kind of like Russian dolls, little subsets of them. This is going to be the polis. That's your state or society. So in that sense, the polis is the most unified, the greatest, has the greatest telos. And in that sense, that becomes, in sort of this barbaric kind of Greek that I've got written out here, it's like a politike koinonia, a political community. So that's really what the state is. So the state, in other words, is a political community. We have all different kinds of communities, but everything is subsumed under this ultimate community, which Aristotle calls the polis, the state, and it's a political community. Now, and remember, don't get too carried away by the translation of state for a polis, because it can mean a city too. The Greeks, there's a lot of debate on this, but roughly, chances are that if you'd have gone into ancient Athens and asked people like Aristotle and Socrates and all that, are you Greek? Well, Aristotle certainly wouldn't, because he wasn't from Athens. But if we picked somebody like Plato, are you Greek or Athenian, or how do you identify themselves? They probably would have strongly identified with their city, like an Athenian, right? So their idea of a state would have been that community, that political community, that politike, koinonia, that they would identify as their city, right? I'm kind of like a Roman, right? I'm from Rome. And we sometimes do that today. We talk about New Yorkers and Londoners and whatnot, Parisians. So some of these larger cities, we tend to have that sort of old Greek way of thinking them as kind of you're a citizen of that city. Smaller places, not so much. But the size of it doesn't matter for when Aristotle's talking about the koinonia. It's not a question of the number of people that are in it. That's not the point. He thinks that's the wrong way to think about this, and we'll look at that in a second. So for now, the key thing is that there's different types of koinonia, different kinds of partnerships and communities, and some of these he talked about, you could say, way back in the Nicomachean Ethics when he was talking about justice and contracts and all those. Those were all kinds of partnerships. They brought people together. But the big one is the political community, and that's the one that we have to really think about, because if you recall at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle kind of despairs of the lack of really good political philosophy, which is kind of surprising because he would have read the Republic, but he doesn't think it's really been that well done. He's got some problems with his predecessors, and we'll get to that in a minute. So now we're looking to try and unpack in a little more detail what this politike koinoine is, this political community. It's the polis, it's the highest thing. So, right, the highest koinoine, it's the polis, it aims at the highest agathos, right? That's the key thing here. So, in other words, basically, I'm kind of repeating myself, but to drive the point home, there's different levels of these things. So there's different levels of the telos or the goal or the good that they're all looking at. There's different unities. So when you think about that, the very essence of the thing is different. The essence of the koinoine in one case is different than the other. The nature of the unity is different. They're all going to they aggregate into something, a greater whole, so to speak, but the unities are different. You can sort of think along this as a your logical model, right? And Aristotle does, and we'll get to that in a second. And that causes a lot of controversy because he roots his politics down into biology. In any case, think of like the human body, right? Your body is a vast, complicated unity of unities, right? You have various unities in your body, like the unity of the circulatory system, right? The heart's pumping, doing its thing, and the veins and arteries are working with it. And that's one unified kind of system. Then you have another unified system that works with it. For respiration, your lungs are working with your heart, but your lungs aren't your heart. They're different. So and then there's the nervous system. So you can think about the human body and the unities within it are all different, but they somehow can work to achieve a larger goal of being a human being, having a human life. So that's what I am. I'm essentially a unity of many, many unities. And if you look back in the history of some interesting things about brain research, maybe even consciousness is like a unity of unities. It seems to be this singular unity, but it too could be this multifaceted, multi-parted, different kinds of unities that all sum up and create this overwhelming unity that we would call consciousness. So Aristotle was very interested by this because society is complicated. It's got different kinds of koinonia at them, different kinds of unities that they're doing their thing, and the goal is to see how they can all fit together, and they seem to, because societies do exist. All right, so we can dig more into those, but just for the sake of our discussion now, it's important to get across the Aristotelian idea that you have different unities. So another thing, you could say, as a corollary of that, is the number of members is irrelevant in each of these communities. Your heart is a heart, right? My heart is what it is, and it's doing its thing. It's got its kind of unity. Someone who's a much bigger person than me, like physically, might have a bigger heart. Or an elephant has they have pretty big hearts. And then a mouse has a much smaller one. It's still a unity. So the nature of its unity is independent of dimensions and size. And Aristotle's point here is that the nature of the unity is going to be independent of the number of members. A family is a family, regardless if there's a couple people in it or dozens or a large family, it still would be a family. And Aristotle is saying, so we want to disassociate or disconnect the notion of something like a quantitative thing, like number of members, from the qualitative or essential aspect of the nature of the unity of the koinonia. So Aristotle says, well, if you think about this, a person in charge of one kind of koinonia has a different kind of authority within that koinonia that they're in charge of than someone in charge of a different kind of koinonia. So if you're in charge of the nervous system, that's different than being in charge of the respiratory system. These are different systems. Yes, they work together. Yes, they must combine in some way to achieve a higher unity, but they are different systems. This is Aristotle's line. And he says that's something that hasn't really been properly looked at. Now, there's an Aristotelian flavor in the criticism that's coming up. We've seen it, right? Where Aristotle talked earlier in the Nicomachean Ethics. Again, go back and look at the Nicomachean Ethics. You can see these books, these volumes, that is, the Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics. They relate a lot to each other. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, remember, he was very critical of a single overarching single good. Remember when he was talking about all those problems of predication across categories and things like that? He brings up similar problems here, thinking that there's a single notion of governance. He doesn't use that term, of course, but that there's a single science of governing or a single science of leadership, a single unique collected body of knowledge that applies to all the different koine. He thinks that's problematic. Or at least here he's saying, I think that's an error. So there are those who have this, shall we say, this single notion of governance, right? And by those, probably means Plato, Socrates. You can look at the late Platonic dialogue of the statesman, where there is sort of a notion of a single political science that's pushed, right? It's through the whole thing, all of society. It's basically same principles. You might tweak them a little bit here and there, but it's roughly the same thing throughout all of society. So the giant sort of koinonia is really just one single thing and governed by the single set of principles. And Aristotle is saying that's a little more differentiated than that. How's he going to show that? We'll look at that in a second. So another character that he might be talking about is Xenophon, who was quite well known at this time as well. In the Memorabilia, he talks in a similar way about this sort of single notion of governing. All right. So once again, Aristotle, has a little look at what people have said, and he disagrees with them. He thinks it's more complicated, more differentiated than that, and so he's going to go on and say, okay, so the different koinonia, different leadership, keep them separate. Again, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, he wasn't happy about the state of politics in terms of as a discipline or as terms of a theory or however you want to put it. He didn't think that politics had been properly investigated. People were doing politics, of course, because societies were there, they're up and running, but philosophers hadn't really thought through politics in the proper amount of detail. Now, again, he had read Plato, so this is what he's saying about someone like Plato. And what he's really coming up with is that we haven't really thought very clearly about the different kinds. What are these different kinds of koinonia? We have to do that. We have to answer that question to really properly investigate politics. And of course, a subsidiary question is, how do all these different kinds of koinonia fit into the polis? Can we tell some kind of story of how the polis comes into being? Now, Plato does that. Socrates talks about that in the Republic. Aristotle seems to gloss over that. But anyways, we'll have to put that to the side. And we're going to look at, shall we say, Aristotle's story of the polis. Right? So that's what we're looking at here. And so the last little bit of this video, what is Aristotle's story of the polis? Well, first off, he thinks that it's, as I stressed earlier, it's natural. Ultimately, his polis is rooted in biology. And not just any biology, Aristotle's biology. So there is a link of a link between Aristotle's political thought and his thinking in biology. So the two are going to overlap, and they overlap, and of course Aristotle's biology is very questionable in some of its views, and they get in, as I said way back in in a video that was sort of promoting this whole discussion of the Nicomachean Ethics and the politics, that underneath it all, right, when he's talking about the ethics and politics, are his other views, metaphysics, right? We've seen telos and all this stuff, which modern political philosophers often don't talk about. But Aristotle thinks that, there's a metaphysical structure under this, and there's a biological structure that's under all this. We'll get into that in a later video, and when we talk more about the interdependence and families and things like that, and of course all kinds of topics will come up. But the important point right now is this highest koinonia, this polis. That's the greatest, most sovereign thing we have. It has the highest good that it aims at. It's going to be the system within which it's make or break for eudaimonia, depending on your polis. But at the end of the day, this polis, Aristotle thinks, is a natural growth. He wants to tell this story of it as a natural thing, growing out of issues or the ideas that he has in his biology. It's a natural growth. It's not a construction. So once again, when Aristotle starts analyzing things like family, relationships, and all these things, they're important, and they're going to be natural. He's trying to say as if, I didn't invent this stuff. I'm looking to see what's there and try to explain it according to its roots in biology. And so that's what we're going to look at in the next chapter, as Aristotle starts to say, when we look at the different kinds of koinonia, we have to go down to the basic building blocks. And that's his method, is to try and unpack something by going down to its smallest unit and then working your way back up. So it's a very analyze to subdivide and subdivide until you get down to the fundamental units. And so what we'll see is some of the fundamental units that he thinks are at the basis of the polis. They're natural outgrowths, and we see the link with biology. See you in the next video.